Welcome, everybody. Hi, I'm Steve Long. I am the Executive Director of the East Hampton Historical Society. So delighted to have you here for the Tom Toomey series. The Historical Society is presenting in partnership with the East Hampton Library. And special thanks to Judith Hope for her support of the Tom Toomey series. I am really thrilled to introduce our speaker, Leah K. Lebec, who will present a history of East Hampton in the American Revolution. During America's 250th this year, the Historical Society is working with the library and many other community partners to produce a podcast, host a history festival, and restore Mulford Farm so we really can emphasize the important role East Hampton played during the American Revolution. And these projects have been informed by the research that you're about to learn. An East Hampton native, Leah received her PhD in French literature from NYU and worked for many years as an educator, writer, and advocate for children with developmental disabilities. With her husband, Alain Lebec, who is here running the slides in case she references him, who's she calling sweetie? They co-founded the literacy program Read Alliance. I had the pleasure of working with Leah for several years when she was a trustee of the East Hampton Historical Society. So I'm so honored and grateful that she is joining us here tonight. Please welcome Leah to the podium.
Thank you for that lovely introduction. Good evening. Thank you for coming, and thank you to the East Hampton Historical Society and the East Hampton Library for hosting this series of Tom Toomey Talks. In this year, the 250th anniversary of the nation's independence, it is indeed fitting to reflect on those from our community here in East Hampton who played a part in that great struggle. I am honored to share an overview of my father's study, The History of East Hampton, New York and the Revolution. A brief introduction. My father, Lawrence Jameson Conslick, was a multifaceted man. I think we kids understood what a Renaissance man was before we had even heard the term. He was a craftsman, a farmer, a scholar, and a sailor, among many other vocations and callings. And he was a loving husband and father. Here is a photo of him as he was about to embark as a World War II Army Air Force lieutenant. He's about 21 years old. He also loved history and devoted a lifetime to studying it. After graduating from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, he taught American history and Latin at Bridgehampton High School for years and years and years. And while he was still in that position, he earned a master's degree in American history from NYU and then went on to earn a PhD in medieval history, again from NYU. Dinner time conversations were pretty interesting. For this thesis, completed in 1960, he focused on the role that East Hampton residents played during the American Revolution. That astonishing moment when, as he wrote, a thinly populated pioneer country was somehow able to break away from a powerful empire. In these pages, we glimpse a people grappling with powers and principalities that were to confound their loyalties, disperse their families, disrupt their lives, and, of course, in many cases, killed them. Although the work is written in a factual style, the reader can't help but come away with a profound respect, even sorrow, as the account unfolds. For this was the moment when the colonists had to make choices that may seem evident now, but which at the time had to be most painful and complex. This was the moment, as my father wrote, when the young continent, so full of hope and promise, dissolved into blood. In preparing this talk, I had to grapple with some obvious challenges. This is a research thesis with footnotes and appendices. It's over 100 pages long. Just about every statement is backed up by copious citations and resource. And I can't go into those, otherwise we would be here till midnight. But the research is there, and if you would like to read the original, the copy that the library has, it's right here in the Long Island collection, either in digital form or in hard copy. Secondly, in giving you an overview of this work, I can't possibly do it justice. This is not my area of expertise. I only hope to touch on a broad summation and the highlights of what he covered. And any faults or oversights or gaps are mine, not his. So without further ado, let's get started. The study looks at East Hampton through the Revolutionary War, during the Revolutionary War, through two main prisms, the Whig record and the Tory record. Before doing so, my dad established the setting, by which he meant the years leading up to 1775. The town was founded between 1648 and 1649, mainly by settlers from Lynn, Massachusetts, who in turn had come from England. The town now includes Gardiner's Island, which had been settled in 1639 by Lyon Gardner. In 1688, Governor Dongan of New York granted a confirmatory patent to several of these earliest settlers, constituting them as the first, quote, trustees of the freeholders and commonalty of the town of East Hampton. And here they are. And a lot of these names will keep echoing down through East Hampton's history. The patent also invested title to all town property in the settlers and their heirs. The Mulford and the Gardner families were among the largest shareholders, and this core group of early settlers also were in charge of government and decided everything by a majority vote. In 1764, more than a century after they arrived, the Reverend Samuel Buell, a Yale graduate who had been installed as Presbyterian minister in East Hampton, estimated that the population was approximately 200 families. Cattle and sheep were an extremely important source of livelihood. Every year they were driven en Montauk, as they said, to pasture there. Many families, especially the wealthier among them, were slave owners. It would take another century and a civil war to begin to right that wrong. To some extent, religion was to function as an indicator of loyalties during the Revolution. In the colonies, Episcopalians, whose origins lay with the Church of England, tended to side with the Tories, or those who were remaining loyal to the crown, where Presbyterians and Congregationalists in general were anti-authoritarian, more oriented toward the idea of a congregation making its own rules for living and worship. Suffolk County in general leaned toward the Whigs, or revolutionaries. In East Hampton, the situation was a little bit more complicated. In the early 1700s, East Hampton did have a church congregational. Then Samuel Buell, along with several other ministers, established the Presbytery of Suffolk. However, this particular presbytery had an authoritarian bent, and it vested more power and control in the minister and elders than in the flock. It frowned on separatist movements and ideas. In any case, my father concludes this section, which was probably more survival rather than philosophy or theology, that most influenced the actions of East Hampton men and women as events unfolded. So let's turn to the record of those who at least initially chose to fight on the side of the revolution. Until about 1763, the British had been preoccupied on this continent with the French and Indian War, a long drawn-out struggle for control in the New World. As this conflict ended, the mother country was heavily in debt and decided to levy a series of taxes on the colonies. These acts only succeeded in arousing an independent American spirit that had been present since Jamestown, 1607. The city of Boston was an epicenter of colonial anger, as its port was very much affected by these taxations without representation. And as we all remember, the Bostonians sent a defiant message to England through the Boston Tea Party, dumping hundreds of crates of British tea into the harbor in 1773. King George III and Parliament responded angrily. Immediately, they passed 4 acts: closing the port of Boston, altering her charter, restricting the jurisdiction of Massachusetts courts, and authorizing quartering of British troops in Boston homes. The colonists were furious over what they called the coercive acts. Britain only increased the tension by naming Thomas Gage governor of Massachusetts and sending troops to support him. As this situation began to escalate, the other colonies were afire with sympathy for the people of Boston. They began to form what were called committees of correspondence or committees of safety. These were an important first step in the colonists' attempts to organize themselves and figure out a response to Great Britain. In New York, East Hampton was one of the first towns to form such a committee. On June 17, 1774, the trustees met here to agree on a position. They unanimously agreed, quote, to cooperate with our brethren in this colony, to save us from the burthens we fear and in a measure already feel from the principles adopted by the British Parliament. They set up their committee of correspondence with John Chatfield, Abraham Gardner, Burnett Miller, Stephen Hedges, Thomas Wickham, and David Mulford. In September of 1774, representatives from all the colonies except Georgia met in Philadelphia to form the First Continental Congress. There, they adopted several measures, including a protest to the king and an embargo on British trade. East Hampton, however, had already adopted an embargo on British goods before one was even ratified by the Continental Congress, which speaks to its enthusiasm at that point for the rebel cause because it had a profitable trade and merchants to consider. With these associations and embargoes, Britain now had to respond to what it considered increasingly illegal activities in the colonies. Governor Gage gave orders to his troops to destroy military supplies stored in the town of Lexington and Concord. In April of 75, British troops advanced on these towns. Keep in mind that the Continental Army had not yet been formed. Minutemen, or militiamen as they were called, were often farmers, not particularly trained, very lightly armed. However, as we remember, they succeeded in driving the British off in Lexington and Concord. As the poet Ralph Waldo Emerson has memorialized the moment, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world. While many colonists still held out the hope of reconciliation with the mother country, it was becoming clear that people had to make a decision whether to figure out a workable solution or to stand up against the coercive acts. It was becoming impossible to remain neutral. On April 29th, the New York colony transmitted to all its counties an association meaning agreement, and that association pledged that whatever actions deemed necessary to oppose, quote, the arbitrary and oppressive acts of the British Parliament. Of note, every male inhabitant of East Hampton capable of bearing arms signed this petition. That same month, in April of '75, the New York colony formed its own Revolutionary Congress, later to be called the Provincial Congress. This Congress would include 6 delegates from Suffolk County, including Thomas Wickham from East Hampton. Just a brief aside about all these terms, associations and committees and congresses. These were the colony's means of organizing themselves, and as you see at the bottom, East Hampton formed its Committee of Safety, later called the Committee of Correspondence. They reported to the Provincial Congress of New York, in this case New York, and also sought help from the Provincial Congress. And in turn, the Provincial Congress reported to the Continental Congress. Back to the gathering storm. 2 confrontations in particular were to now seriously impact the people of East Hampton. One was the Siege of Boston, which began in April of '75. The Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, overcame British troops at Fort Ticonderoga and Crown Point, right up there. These represented an extremely important stronghold, safeguarding the best route from Canada, where the British were landing, down the Hudson River Valley toward New York and all the other colonies. Whoever controlled those became a tussle between the colonists and Great Britain, and they were to change hands several times during the war. But how was East Hampton affected by these seemingly remote campaigns? In June of '75, General Washington took command of the newly formed Continental Army, and he took over the siege of Boston. The people of East Hampton watched this situation fearfully, knowing that their homes and their livestock were in direct line of attack should the British be driven down the coast. The cattle on Montauk were an obvious target for the British fleet and army. The joint East Hampton and Southampton Committees of Safety sent several urgent letters to the Provincial Congress of New York begging for protection. The New York Provincial Congress, too, was concerned about the threat from British warships. On July 31st of '73, they warned East Hampton and Southampton that British troops were moving out of Boston, and Montauk was the possible target. The fleet did come down the coast and landed on Gardiner's Island on August 11th of '75. They plundered the cattle there, the first of several raids or attempted raids on either Montauk, Fisher's Island, or Gardiner's Island. Keep in mind that the British themselves were desperate for fresh food of any kind because all they had on their ships in any quantity were dried meat and salt peas. And, salt, yeah, I think that's
salt meat and dried peas.
Salt meat and dried peas. And many British soldiers were to die of scurvy, not gunshot, before the war's end. The New York, the Provincial Congress was distressed over these raids, but reluctant to furnish enough troops for the protection of eastern Long Island. Why? Because of the intense pressure for troops at Crown Point and Ticonderoga. Washington had appointed Major General Philip Schuyler to take command at these strongholds, and Schuyler was calling for just about all troops in New York to go up there. As 1775 closed and the new year dawned, Neither war nor independence had been formally declared, even though fighting had been going on for almost a year. In January of '76, however, Tom Paine's pamphlet, Common Sense, appeared. Its impact was immediate. This extremely influential pamphlet spurred the colonists towards a clearer focus and an outright declaration of war. One of the ideas that resonated, just one of the ideas, was that it was absurd for England, a small country, to think that it could rule despotically over an entire continent. If ever there was an example of the power of the pen, it was to be found in this small tract which converted thousands overnight to the revolutionary cause. In East Hampton, people were on high alert. On March 4th of '76, the Provincial Congress warned John Chatfield, again, remember he's chairman of the joint East Hampton and Southampton committees, that General William Howe, commander of the British forces, had departed from Boston and that there might be an attack on Long Island. Chatfield wrote that 20 sail had already been seen off Montauk and begged for more protection. In response, Congress sent 1,000 pounds of powder and 4,000 pounds of lead, and also decided to station 3 companies on the eastern end of Long Island, but unfortunately, a company would consist of only 60 men, so the committees of correspondence would have felt that this was highly inadequate. But almost all New York troops continued to be directed towards Schuyler and the Ticonderoga campaign. In July of '76, the committees wrote yet again, this is about the 6th time, to the Provincial Congress, asking if Captain Jonathan Holbert's men could be stationed on Montauk. Holbert was part of the revolutionary troops, and he had actually a house in Sag Harbor, but he had men from all around Southampton, East Hampton. But Schuyler called him as well up there. So basically, East Hampton, Montauk, etc., were left without protection. At this point, several East Hampton families began to flee to Connecticut, the beginning of what was to become a huge exodus of East Hampton families from the wharves of Sag Harbor over to Connecticut. They had good reason for alarm. After General Howe had been forced by Washington to evacuate Boston, he sailed to Halifax, Nova Scotia, and from there he decided his next move. He would return and use the New York colony as his base of operations. In June, he set out from Halifax and sailed to Staten Island, where he landed on July 2nd with about 10,000 men and 130 ships. There's Staten Island at the very bottom left. 10 days later, he was joined by his brother, Admiral Richard Howe, with a fleet of 150 ships. And by early August, the British troops on Staten Island numbered over 32,000 men. This number was greater than the combined population of Kings County and Manhattan at the time. Moreover, to quote my father, this expedition was fully trained, abundantly supplied, and supported by 10 ships of the line, 20 frigates, hundreds of transports. To oppose this mighty army, the Americans had 19,000 amateurs, poorly trained, poorly armed, and poorly trained. Let's note that a ship of the line typically carried up to 60 guns. A frigate of the Revolutionary War period carried 38 guns. Here is an artist's rendering of what that mass of British ships must have looked like in lower New York Harbor. Moreover, even this paltry force of 19,000 patriots was split because Washington had been unsure of where Howe would land. Consequently, there were only about 5,800 men in the Brooklyn lines trying to hold back this huge army. David and Goliath come to mind, except in this case, David had no chance. 2 Long Island regiments fought in this battle. Colonel Hosea Smith and Colonel Geronimus Remsen. Included in Colonel Smith's regiment was a company of Minutemen from East Hampton under Captain Ezekiel Mulford. Tracing the record, it is probable that most of these men were assigned to guard the Flatbush Pass, that's that circle on the bottom, or the Bedford Pass. Unfortunately, whichever pass they occupied, it mattered little. They were surrounded by Hessian forces to the east and British to the north and west. Hessians, you may remember, were mercenaries from Germany, highly trained, deadly. Many of Captain Mulford's company were so young. These 2 slides coming up next, I think, are the most important of this presentation. These are the young men who fought in this battle, and they were all from East Hampton. And I just want us to dwell on the names for a minute, because I think these names do echo down through East Hampton history. If you would just go to the next one. Oh. This battle was over quickly. The American forces were crushed. There was no other word. After heroic resistance, most were killed, wounded, or driven to surrender. On April 29, 1776, Long Island fell to British occupation. Those captured were kept in notorious prison ships in New York Harbor, where most died of starvation. This was the largest battle of the American Revolution, and according to many historians, the most devastating. It's important to note as well that it's not an exhaustive list of all East Hampton men who fought in the Revolutionary War, but it is probably the one battle that took the lives of most East Hampton residents. On September 1st of 1776, now begins the occupation. On September of 76, British Major General Delaney ordered all Long Island residents to take an oath of loyalty to the Crown. On September 12th, Washington abandoned Long Island to the enemy. East Hampton passed to General Howe's military control and Governor Tryon's civil control. On October 1st of 76, General Howe ordered all grain, cattle, and forage to be seized from the residents of Long Island. More and more East Hampton families continued to flee to Connecticut. Those who remained were to suffer terribly in the years ahead, as both loyalists and patriots plundered them for all the grain and food, livestock, and money they could possibly find. The situation in East Hampton was so bad that people were reduced to begging for bread. As Samuel Buell wrote to Governor Trumbull of Connecticut, quote, "The people are in a distressed and perplexed situation. They fear to become a torch on fire at both ends." Amidst this fire of occupation and starvation, there were a few moments of resistance now and then, but by and large, the people of East Hampton could only hang on, hoping to survive. Most East Hampton people took the oath of loyalty to the Crown because obviously they were forced to do so. Some survivors continued to join the Continental Army and fight. And yet, there is also evidence that there were a few East Hampton residents whose dealings with the British were to come into question. The last part of my father's study focuses attention on 2 prominent examples, Samuel Buell and Abraham Gardner. In July of 1776, General William Howe issued a proclamation offering pardon to the loyal inhabitants of this island who would proclaim their loyalty to His Majesty's government. Few took the oath, but after the Battle of Long Island, it was a completely different story. Colonel H.B. Livingston of the Continental Army wrote to Governor Trumbull of Connecticut that the people of East Hampton had almost universally taken the oath. Indeed, so there would not be the slightest doubt of East Hampton's position, the Committee of Correspondence dissolved itself on October 21st, 76, with this declaration: "We, the Committee of East Hampton in the County of Suffolk, being thoroughly convinced of the injurious tendency of our former meetings and resolutions, willing to manifest our hearty disapprobation of all such illegal measures, do hereby dissolve the committee, and so far as in us lies, revoke and disannul all former orders and resolutions of all committees and congresses whatsoever as being undutiful to our lawful sovereign, repugnant to the principles of the British Constitution, and ruinous in the extreme to the happiness and prosperity of this county." Such a renouncement of a prior position can, of course, be understood as a statement made under extreme duress, forced. But Livingston went on to describe some in East Hampton, a few, as actively aiding British troops and hindering Patriot troops, for instance, by furnishing livestock and provisions to the British. "If speedy means are not used," wrote Livingston, "the whole county of Suffolk will surely be up in arms against us." And then a very surprising letter appears. In December of 76, British Governor Tryon of New York wrote to Lord Germain, British Secretary of State, describing the situation in the New York colony. In that letter, Tryon included a letter that he had received from one Samuel Buell. This letter, Tryon wrote, would more fully explain the sentiments of the people of East Hampton. It was found in the Office of Public Records, London. It's dated December 10th, 1776. The letter is very long, but my father insisted on quoting it in full because, as he said, it is difficult to paraphrase, and it is important that Buell be heard correctly. First, Buell informs Governor Tryon that the proclamation of the oath of loyalty has been read in church to the town people, and that he is sure everyone will gladly sign it. The inhabitants honestly design to remain in peaceable obedience to His Majesty and will not take up arms nor encourage others to take up arms in opposition to his authority. He then goes on to inform the governor that Continental soldiers have just landed in Sag Harbor. What number there is in Sag Harbor I can't find out yet, nor their design. Is Buell offering to find out, to gather information for the occupiers? Next, he begs the governor's protection, suffered to abide in a peaceful subjection to His Majesty. He then adds, "As for my own self, sir, I feel myself a subject of King George and honestly mean to act in character. I have been so active in getting the fat cattle to General Howe and have so warmly opposed the people leaving the island that I have been seized and carried down to Sag Harbor in order to be transported to the Main, but indisposition prevented, I now stand upon a parole of honor." This sentence about the fat cattle seems to bear out Colonel Livingston's complaint that people in East Hampton were furnishing the British with cattle. It also seems that Buell had already been threatened with expulsion, and a parole of honor means that he has taken an oath to have no further correspondence with the enemy, with the occupiers. Finally, he ends with an explanation that he has been asked by the, quote, principal inhabitants of town to seek Tryon's protection, but they have since withdrawn their request out of fear of the soldiers in Sag Harbor. The gentlemen that before urged withdrew their petition this evening since they heard of the coming of the Continental soldiers. And now, sir, I am not without fears. You will excuse me if I subscribe, sir, incognito. Unfortunately for Buell's attempt to remain anonymous, however, Governor Tryon added a note at the bottom of the letter. It read, "The above wrote by the Reverend Mr. Buell, Presbyterian minister for the Township of East Hampton, a favorer of the rebel rank until converted by the victory of the 27th of August." Yikes. Everyone can make of this letter what they will. My father's comment was, it's important to quote exactly what he said, "Even if one insists that the purpose in this letter is the welfare of his parish and an attempt to exempt the townspeople from impressment into British service, this still seems too much like collaboration." Nevertheless, he adds this sentence, which I also think is important. He notes that Buell is to be remembered for other works in his life, most notably for Clinton Academy, quote, "his most important work and enduring monument." But who were these principal inhabitants to whom Buell refers? It is likely that one of them was Abraham Gardner. These two families, the Buell and Gardner family, were united by marriage. Samuel Buell's daughter, Jerusha, had married David Gardner, the sixth proprietor of Gardner's Island. David passed away early at age 36, and then his uncle, Abraham Gardner, became the titular head of Gardner's Island and the head of one of the wealthiest families in town. He was also, according to several accounts, an active Tory. The historian Lorenzo Sabine labels Abraham Gardner as a Tory from East Hampton, but he offers no definitive evidence supporting that claim. Nevertheless, Abraham's name keeps coming up in accounts implicating him as somebody who was actively helping the British during this occupation of East Hampton. First, he was suspected of colluding with the British commanding officer Abijah Willett when Willett landed on Gardner's Island to plunder the cattle there. After that raid, a letter surfaced, signed by Willett, not addressed to anyone, but reading thusly, "So they loaded all the vessels. He can't come to your house. I'm going to send you an account. I took all these things. Send me some other pigs and fowls and potatoes. And when you come to Boston, I will secure your interest to you within my power. I'm sorry it's not in my power to come to your house, but so good a win." He means we have so good a win right now, we have to take advantage of it. We can't stay. I am yours, Abijah Willett. So the references to your house and your island reinforce this assumption among East Hampton patriots that the head of Gardner's Island, Abraham Gardner, was the recipient of this letter and was colluding with Willett to supply the British forces. Gardner fought that charge, and the Joint Committee of East Hampton and Southampton cleared him. But then he was in trouble again the following year. On May 4th of 76, an order went out from New York Committee of Safety to disarm all loyalists. Abraham Gardner was arrested as a loyalist by the Continental Army. Yet again, his name appears in connection with an arms raid carried out in East Hampton in 76. And it didn't help his reputation either that he had sheltered in his home for several weeks Major General John Andre, well-known loyalist, just before both Andre and Benedict Arnold were discovered to be plotting with the British to take over West Point. Colonel Gardner died in East Hampton in 1782, with many of these questions still unresolved. In conclusion, It is obvious that East Hampton played an important role in the Revolutionary War. One glance at that roster of young men who died for the independence of this country reaffirms that statement. It is equally obvious that for most, resistance ended with the Battle of Long Island and with the years of brutal hardship that followed. And it seemed that among those who remained, there were still some active loyalists and even some collaborators. But, as my father concludes, whatever the conclusion may be about the patriotic zeal of some townsmen, it must be tempered with a large measure of sympathy for their suffering. He ends on a quote from the historian Wilbur Abbott, who called the depredation of the citizens of New York, New Jersey, and Long Island the darkest chapter of the American Revolution. And yet, out of that dark chapter and all the chapters of the American Revolution come two of the noblest documents in our nation's history, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States. May we never forget the struggles and the sacrifices that produced them. Thank you.
But if anybody wanted to ask anything about that or about semi-quincentennial celebrations in East Hampton? Oh, sure.
Did the Washington Spy Trail come out this far east, or did it stop near Oyster Bay?
The Washington Spy Trail is really something that's much farther west. Unfortunately, it's a great, today for tourism, not something East Hampton town can take advantage of. So, a big round of applause again for Leah. Thank you very much.
Could the children of Lawrence J. Consulate stand for a moment? And the grandchildren. I just want to recognize them.
Everybody's related in East Hampton.